Hello, this is the Libertarian Dilettante, and welcome to Episode 2 of my Democracy 3 Let's Play. In Turn 1, I focused on criminal justice reform, and I'm just ending that turn now. And in the next turn, I want to focus on the economy and the budget. But first, we have an urgent policy question to consider. So we're being pressured to ban alcohol adverts. There's a proposal for a law to outlaw the banning of advertising on television. From a libertarian perspective, this is a fairly easy question. We pretty much reject bans outright. If you don't like seeing alcohol advertised on your television, you can change the channel or you can turn off your TV. And that should pretty much take care of it. Okay. So we now have more political capital, and my big goal for the economy is to use the private sector as the engine of growth. So in order to do that, we want to reduce taxation so that investors can keep more of their money. They have a greater incentive to make investments in the United States and so on. But before we can reduce taxes, we have to reduce spending first, because if we cut taxes without cutting spending, then we're just deficit spending and we'll have to tax more in the future to make up for that. And that's not what we're looking to do. We are looking to create a long-term, stable economy that is based on private enterprise. So how can we cut spending as the United States? One very obvious place, of course, is the military. The United States has by far the most expensive military in the world, and frankly, it's more than enough to protect the country. So from a libertarian perspective, we don't want an enormous military. We want a military that is adequate to protect its people, and that's really all we want it for. So instead of spending $232 billion on an overwhelming force, we will bring that down to well-trained and save about $100 billion. Now, one unfortunate effect of this is that it's going to hit unemployment. We're going to put a lot of people out of work, and you'll see that I'll be doing something to mitigate that effect, because we don't want to pull the rug completely out from under these service people who've promised to support the United States and its military. But at the same time, we just don't need an enormous military. So with apologies to Poland and South Korea, we are going to be scaling back. All right, so we just implemented a very large spending cut, and now I would like to complement that with a tax cut that's going to encourage economic growth. And the most obvious place, I think, that a libertarian would look first to cut taxes is the income tax, because we don't particularly want to tax people and reduce the incentive for people to earn income. We like it when people earn income. So we want to keep the rates low if we can. And the idea is that if we don't tax people's income as much, they'll have more money in their pockets to pay for the things that they want to do, to pay for their own priorities. And unfortunately, this game has a very bizarre perspective on the income tax. So if we look here, I'm currently taxing at an average rate of 31%, and that's bringing in $635 billion. And this $635 billion is coming from the incomes of American workers and businesses and so on. So in the real world, it makes sense to say the government could reduce taxes, and that extra money will end up back in the pockets of workers and businesses and investors and so on, and so they'll be able to spend that on other things that they care about. But let's take a quick look at what the game thinks. that people are going to spend this money on. And the only place you see there's nothing, no effect on GDP, there's essentially no cost to increasing taxes. If I double the amount of money I take out of people's paychecks, it will have no effect other than on poor earnings, middle earnings, and high earnings. And you might say, well, that makes sense, right? When we take money away from these middle earning people in taxes, it's going to reduce their ability to pay for what? It turns out car usage, air travel, and internet currency adoption. So if we raise people's income taxes, if we double their income taxes, they're going to cancel that road trip, and that's about it. According to this game, if we raise the income tax and then we just totally squander all of that money, there's still no loss. There's no cost whatsoever to taxing that money in the first place, regardless of how it's spent. And that's pretty silly. So instead, I'm going to go look for a policy that this game does recognize as creating economic growth. And I'm going to find that here, the Enterprise Investment Scheme. And basically what this does is it provides a tax break for people who are making investments. Now the game seems to think that wealthy individuals are going to be the ones investing money, and of course they are, but in a libertarian society, you're also going to see a lot more middle-class people investing money. For one thing, they're going to have more money available because we're reducing their taxes, so there's more money for them to take care of their own needs rather than rely on the government. And for another thing, investing is going to be a more attractive option. So what I really hope to accomplish with this is reducing barriers to entry. This talks about small startup companies. And so what we want to do is make it easier for people to start new businesses or to expand small businesses into medium-sized businesses. We're looking for a sort of grassroots growth in the economy. And we're going to be able to achieve that because currently heavy taxes and regulations are a burden on businesses. And so for the large established businesses, that's a cost of business that they can just absorb. But for someone who's trying to get started, it can be a big deterrent. And that's something that economists call a barrier to entry. It's like a fence around a certain industry that says, keep out, it costs too much, there's too much risk, there's too much regulation, it's really hard to break in and compete in this area of the economy. And our policies are going to try to consistently reduce those barriers to entry. So we really want to make it easier for new businesses to step in and compete with the old ones. And that's really what this enterprise investment scheme is going to be all about in my mind. And it's part of a broader policy in which we favor a free market economy that is based on competition. One more thing I would like to point out about this, the description here claims that obviously indirectly this scheme is being subsidized by those without savings to invest. And this is really kind of a backward way of looking at things. We're not taking money away from people who don't have savings and giving it to people who do. That's what that would suggest. Clearly, if your subsidy is coming from people who don't have any money, then it's not really much of a subsidy at all. But back to the larger point here, this is going to be something I'm using to drive forward competition within the economy. So that's something that we're going to keep in mind moving forward. I'm going to implement this policy. This does raise GDP, and that is what you would expect. When you reduce taxes, that leaves more money available for the private sector. And so there's going to be more money invested, and overall the GDP will grow. So I apply that change, and I'm now down to just one political capital, so obviously I'm not going to be doing any more on this turn. Let's proceed to the next one. All right, there's a new urgent policy question, debt protection law. Debt collection agencies, these are basically like payday lenders. I'm not going to read all of this, but the basic libertarian approach to this question is to say that you don't help people by taking away their options. So the way that these payday lenders operate is people come to them when they're in a desperate situation. Nobody goes to a payday lender because, you know, they think it's like a great deal or something. They do it out of desperation. So if you're in a situation where you're already desperate and you've decided that a payday lender is your best option, the government is not going to help you at all by taking that option away from you. And realistically, what ends up happening is people then turn to a pawn shop instead. So instead of paying some moderate amount of money in interest on a small loan, they end up paying a larger amount of money in with the whole rigmarole of pawning things. I'm not actually very familiar with how that works, but I guess it's a pretty bad deal if that's how you try to raise money. But the other option is something like you just get evicted, right? You can't get a loan from a payday lender. No bank wants to lend to you, so you just can't raise the money. Then you get evicted, and that causes a huge disruption in your life, or maybe your car gets repossessed or something like that. And the bottom line is that the cost is greater than the payday loans, which is why you went to the payday lender in the first place. So the bottom line is we're going to allow these agencies to operate, which is pretty much, we allow most businesses to operate. So long as it's a deal made between consenting adults, the government is not going to want to interfere with that. Okay, I'm going to skip all this. We haven't spent a lot of time yet. You will notice that crime is on its way down. That was our top priority. And now that a little bit of time has passed, we can see that that's beginning to have some effect. All right, so I've got more political capital again, and if we look at our income and expenditures, we are still running a pretty significant deficit. So I'm going to come back to these expenditures. You'll see that military spending has already been cut way down because in this game, people don't wait around to make big changes. When I cut military spending, it takes effect. So the next thing I'm going to do is look for another program to cut, and I see one I like right here. The space program is a huge expense, and it's not really something that's very justifiable from a libertarian point of view, because I can say, maybe I don't particularly care about sending a man to the moon or sending a probe to Venus or whatever. So why should I have to pay for that? Why can't that be something that's funded by like some kind of voluntary organization or whatever? So because my government needs to reduce spending, and because in real life the United States did actually cut NASA and we no longer do these really expensive reusable shuttle things, I'm going to do something similar and cut back our NASA budget. I'm just going to go ahead and cut it all the way down to there. Maybe that sounds a little too cheap. Let's go with big telescopes right here. Okay. So I'm making a cut. One thing that this is going to do that I'm not very thrilled about is reduce my technology. But I'd like to address this because often you see government programs justified with something like this. They say, well, yes, the space program is very expensive, but we need it because NASA develops new technologies. And of course that's true, but if you want new technologies, you should just invest directly in new technologies. It doesn't really make sense to have a space program as a way of developing like consumer products or something. That's very indirect, very inefficient, and we just don't want the government spending that much money on a program that isn't really part of our essential services that the government needs to provide. So, as in real life, we will make some reductions to the space program. Now, I've made some pretty significant cuts to the military and to the space program. Both of those are going to cause people to be put out of work. So in order to counterbalance that, I'm going to move on to plank 3 of my platform, as this is, after all, the third turn of the game. I'm going to implement adult education subsidies, which are a way to encourage people to retrain and continue their education after they have joined the workforce. This includes evening classes, distance learning, and we want to raise the overall education level of the workforce. This is something that I addressed directly in plank 3 of my platform, so I don't really feel the need to say much more about it. This is to help put people back to work, people who just are in a position to pursue these education subsidies, but especially people who were in the military or were part of NASA because they may have recently lost their jobs. This, unfortunately, does not give us a bonus directly to technology, so we might want to come back to that one. But we do like the boost to education, and we especially like this boost to productivity, because labor productivity is the one thing that actually increases wages in the long run. It's really the only way that people can become more prosperous over time, is to become more productive. So we're going to go ahead and spend some money. This is actually very cheap in this game, but it's necessary to support people and get them back to work. All right, so I've once again exhausted my political capital. I'm going to do one more turn. Okay, so here's my quarterly report. The vigilante mobs situation is at an end because our criminal justice reforms are beginning to bear fruit. And the game thinks that our people are working too hard, and so there's a stress epidemic. And basically, the libertarian response to that is to say that we want a very flexible labor market. We don't want the government trying to impose standards on how employers and employees agree to contract with each other. And so the best way to reduce this stress epidemic is to let people negotiate for what they want and to create a labor market that is as flexible as possible to accommodate many different types of arrangements. All right, and now I'm going to turn to kind of a centerpiece of my economic policy. It's something that I'm going to have to sort of reimagine because the way it's described in the game isn't very libertarian sounding. Here we go. Rural development grants. As technology advances and more citizens take jobs in our cities, there is a danger that poverty and unemployment will rise to unacceptable levels in the countryside. Rural development grants do distort the free market, but they also support rural businesses and prevent poverty amongst farmers and other rural occupations. So, if what we're doing is actually providing grants for rural areas, then yes, that is a distortion of the free market because we don't have any reason to prefer rural areas to urban areas, right? Why should the government be helping out people who live in one place and not helping out people who live in another? But as I said, I'm going to reimagine this policy instead, more like as something that is the result of government policies that make the labor market more flexible and that encourage competition by reducing barriers to entry, like I was saying earlier. So what rural development grants represents to me is going to be more like smaller businesses that are starting up and competing with bigger businesses, or that are cooperating with them. So you might have a big business in Seattle, let's say, that wants to sub out some of their HR work. And what we want to allow to have happen is for them to be able to hire a small company or open a small office in some little town somewhere in Washington state or in Kansas or wherever, where costs are lower, right? The cost of labor is lower and the cost of rent is lower in these non-urban areas. And so the government is going to step back and allow businesses to become more successful in these lower cost areas. And when we implement this policy, we will see that one of the things it does is raise GDP. Now, the most obvious question for a libertarian is, if these investments raise GDP, if they're good, profitable investments, why would we need grants to make them possible in the first place, right? Why aren't investors already investing in rural areas if there's a payoff for it? And I think in real life, that is what would happen. There's not a lot of opportunity in the real world for the government to step in and say, you know, we're going to start a brand new business, or we're going to invest in a particular sector or whatever, because that's where the money is. It just doesn't work that way, because the government is not better at running a profitable business than private enterprise. One of the reasons I really like this policy is because it reduces unemployment. And according to this game, unemployment is basically a function of how many people the government hires. The game does a really poor job of modeling the idea that a successful private enterprise economy will reduce unemployment. So within the game, I need to find a policy that does that. I think this at least represents employment within the private sector. And as I said, I'm seeing this as a way of reducing burdens on small businesses and making it easier for new businesses to start up and compete. So that's what this policy represents to me. And I will just go ahead and tip my hand. One more policy I have that I'm going to implement next turn, unless I happen to have enough political capital. Let's just check that out real quick. But first, apply these changes. So this, again, is a cornerstone of my economic development policy. I have 2 political capital. What I want to implement is telecommuting. There it is. Okay, I can grab it this turn, which I really like. So this complements the rural development grants, because if people don't have to actually physically drive into the office, then they don't need to be living as close to the center of the city, right? So we've got our office for Microsoft, let's say, in Seattle, but we are passing this initiative that somehow makes it easier for companies to offer telecommuting. So now somebody who contributes to the work at that office in Seattle can be living in some small town. And that opens up a larger pool of people, a larger pool of talent that is available to contribute to the economy. Plus all of the other normal benefits for this telecommuting initiative. So that's how I want to get that rural development grants policy done. And with that, I've spent all of my political capital, and I've put in place an economic set of policies that over time is going to increase my GDP and help me to close this budget deficit. All right, so that pretty much wraps up this turn, and I'll see you in the next one.